I'm even more thrilled to introduce Lily Hirsch. She's currently a visiting scholar at Cal State Bakersfield and has taught at Cleveland State as well. She is the author of many articles and several books, one on Berlin Jewish Culture League, and also a fascinating topic of music and criminal law, music and crime prevention. And she's got a forthcoming book that's co-edited with Tina Furhoff on the subjects related to this conference. And today she will speak on writing and remembering past wrongs, the music suppressed by the Nazis in American concert performance. Give her a warm welcome.
I'm going to repeat, like Derek Katz mentioned, a thank you to Bob Elias and Mike Beckerman for inviting me to this event. On October 4th, 2012, in the audience at a Recovered Voices concert in Santa Monica, I found myself speaking to the individual sitting to my right, Louisa Zaney. Before the concert began, I asked her about her attraction to the evening's event. She explained that she respected the conductor James Conlon's reputation, enjoyed chamber music, the focus of the night, and wanted to take advantage of music so near her house. Still, she admitted very honestly that she was, quote, a little uncomfortable initially that night. She had overheard audience members discussing the composer's fates and their own Jewish histories. But why this discomfort? Did she feel that she somehow had no right to this concert, that this music was not her own? Was a Jewish self-identification or historical connection necessarily a part of the evening? Or was this discomfort generated by a clash of conscience, looking forward to the music while acknowledging its violent historical context? Fast forward to July 11th, 2013. In Tablet magazine, James Leffler addressed performances devoted to the problematic circumscription Holocaust music, concentrating for the most part on the work of Francesco Latoro. He wrote, "It may sound like heresy to criticize a pious act of Holocaust remembrance, but the true heresy is to turn Jewish composers into shadow images defined only by their status as Hitler's victims," unquote. Online reactions below Leffler's article varied widely. A surprisingly unreflective response from the author of Virtually Jewish, Ruth Ellen Gruber, complained, quote, "I don't understand his criticism. It smacks of, oh, here is someone being praised. I guess I better shoot him down," unquote. Another poster, Nicole Maratova-Chernesky, simply seemed stuck on the notion that work in this area is, yes, noble. She asked, quote, "So why on earth indeed criticize a pious act? Is performance connected to the Holocaust so lofty, so personal as to be beyond reproach?" I offer these two moments as my testament to the many issues evoked by the remarkably vibrant, wide-ranging, and transnational arena of concertizing currently devoted to music denigrated during the Nazi era. These events arguably represent a powerful circumvention of Adorno's famous dictum marking as barbaric the creation of poetry after Auschwitz. To date, however, there has been no in-depth scholarly intervention into any aspect of this work. Given the literature limitations as well as the unwieldy reach of the topic, this paper is necessarily a starting point, an initial look, confined to analysis of my collected data regarding the places, dates, and repertoire relevant to this realm of performance in the United States, despite its connections to similar work and earlier work in other countries. This paper also focuses on the impulse to effect constructive change, currently bolstering such music making, the diverse yet conceptually positive goals that, as I will show, help explain the myriad responses to and potential pitfalls within this concertizing. By exploring this opposition between noble intention and related negative response or repercussion, this paper contributes to a small but growing body of scholarship exposing the contradictions embedded in efforts to impact society constructively through music. Along these lines, I will raise questions about the role these performances play in a problematic conflation of Nazi-era composition and Jewish music. To begin, let us define suppressed music. This larger category often marks musical activity devoted to persecution during the Nazi era, and is the title of a significant listserv dedicated to discussion and dissemination of related composition and performance. As outlined in a recent call for papers for a conference in New Zealand entitled Recovering Forbidden Voices, Responding to the Suppression of Music in World War II, music suppressed during the Nazi era includes music written in ghettos, concentration camps, and in exile, along with works classified and banned by the Nazis as Entartete-Musik. Performances of suppressed music, according to this definition, can merge several different categories of music making, mixing music banned during the era, as well as composers persecuted or forbidden at the time, and thus exiled, interned, or in the case of some composers labeled Entartete, degenerate, long deceased, a posthumous persecution. With this complex treatment, suppressed music is a generic set, as David Levin and Ken Reinhardt recognize, unbranded by any one defining characteristic. My representative sampling follows by necessity general use of this complicated category amalgamation, collected through internet searches and reviews of news sources, and thus limited by the reach of cyberspace or accessible news media. Based on this data, concerts devoted to music suppressed during the Nazi era often appear to be the regular work of an organized program or individual, to name a few: Michael Christie, James Conlon, Daniel Hope, Mina Miller, Judith Sheridan, and Marshall Taylor. Titles of events and programs converge and diverge in language, and this language offers some insight into the intended positive impact to which these individuals and others work. First and foremost, titles often feature re, the prefix of return, again. We see this trend in prominent use of the terms rediscovered and recovering or recovered. Here's example 3, and example 3 continued. And again, this is just a sampling of many other concerts with this wording. This word choice points to the goal of revival, defined by ethnomusicologist Tamara Livingston as, quote, social movements which strive to restore a musical system believed to be disappearing or completely relegated to the past for the benefit of contemporary society, unquote. James Conlon's project, Recovered Voices at Los Angeles Opera, a prominent and influential case in point, fits decidedly into this category, in my reading, especially given its framing and public explanation. I should mention, due to length limits, I cannot consider the full context of the statements to which I will now refer, and thus must simply chronicle displayed intentions. That being said, in the online welcome on the URL site connected to Recovered Voices, musicologist Michael Beckerman insists, quote, our goal is neither to write eulogies nor to create, oops, that's a little preview, write eulogies nor to create narratives or spins concerning the material we present, unquote. In this way, the URL Foundation contributes to what Beckerman terms a dynamic revival. Conlon himself favors wording related to recovering a loss, and similarly avoids ties to memorialization. Rather, he seeks to mend the perceived German canon, repairing the, quote, greatest single rupture in what had been a centuries-long stream of German classical music, unquote. In addition to this pronounced commitment to musical restoration, Conlon, like other revival organizers, consistently stresses his project's benefit to contemporary society. In this example, that benefit is one of posthumous justice. In an NPR interview, he explained, quote, you cannot undo the justice of lost lives, of the cruelty, but in the case of the composers, you can do the one thing that would have meant the most to them, which is to perform their music, unquote. This notion of justice seems to move beyond Conlon's aspirations in other programs devoted to this repertoire, programs that seem to suggest in title wording that undoing death is in a way possible. In concerts of suppressed music, references to some sort of void, silence, darkness, suppression offsets imagery related to life or rebirth, reborn, life, or lives. This is example 4, and example 4 continued. This dichotomy of dark and light is complementary in theories of rebirth, defined as both reincarnation as well as the process of being born again during life. Both conceptions of rebirth are contingent on a form of survival, a confrontation with darkness, injustice, and/or death, which has particular resonance in relationship to the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, the notion of rebirth, darkness to light, related to classic myths of salvation, held a specific place in American Jewish thinking about Israel. This redemptive coloring also operated and continues to operate in American responses to the Holocaust more generally. What many scholars have observed as the Americanization of the Holocaust privileges stories of redemption and tolerance, pluralism, and human rights, all themes significant to the construction of American identity. Romantic thinking about music resonates significantly with these American notions of survival and rebirth after the Holocaust. As Hegel proclaimed in lectures during the 1820s, music is, quote, the art of the soul, a subjective art directly addressed to the soul. Accordingly, through music, a composer, his or her soul, could theoretically live on after death, reborn in concert. Contrasting this goal of musical restoration and posthumous justice, other projects and concerts emphasize terms such as memory or remembering and remembrance, which point to efforts of memorialization and commemoration. Here's example 5. And example 5 continued. Mina Miller's Music of Remembrance, More, in Seattle, is a significant example of this latter aim, again in my reading. Devoted to, quote, remembering Holocaust musicians and their art, unquote, the group's concerts of suppressed music, as well as new work related to the Holocaust, annually mark the anniversary of Kristallnacht in the fall and Holocaust Remembrance Day each spring. With this emphasis, More is explicitly aimed at remembrance, and thus most closely operates within memory work, making the past present. The means of this pastness in the present is commemoration, a complex symbolic act of collective memory transmission, which, according to historian Jeffrey Cubitt, contributes, quote, distinctively and in many social settings vitally to making the past an active rather than a merely passive element in people's social awareness, unquote. Such activity also represents, in the estimation of philosophy scholar Anita Kasabova, a way, quote, to account for unimaginable events caused by our species, unquote. More is self-exploratory in this way, a program focused on understanding, raising awareness through remembrance, and thus arguably a retrospective benefit concert series of sorts. I should mention that More's aims, like Conlon's intended goals, are not restricted to a single notion of the positive work music can serve in concert. In addition to a primary focus on remembrance, the More mission statement reads, quote, it is a priceless gift that much of this music has survived as moral and artistic defiance in the face of catastrophe. We must ensure that these voices of musical witness be heard, unquote. This emphasis on a moral imperative helps situate More and its goals within the realm of revival as well. Though commemoration and revival represent two different impulses, in concertizing devoted to music banned by the Nazis, these goals can coexist, or at least exist side by side to varying degrees. With aspirations to right and or remember past wrongs, these programs aim to perform a greater good within society. And I would argue that the specific repertoire of concerts devoted to, quote, suppressed music within my sampling confirms these aims more generally. The popularity in particular of Erwin Schulhoff and Victor Ullmann, the two composers most often performed at these events, is proof. Both composers work within efforts of rebirth, recovery, or rediscovery, and thus revival, given fascination with the composer's musical mastery and changing styles, the music itself. They also operate effectively in events focused more directly on death, and therefore memory and commemoration with their respective deaths in concentration camps. There is, of course, much more to be said in this regard that'll have to wait for another forum. But the aim-sustaining performances of music denigrated during the Third Reich also implicate competing agendas, as well as concerns about the ethics of Holocaust representation, all of which can undermine or at least muddy positive intentions. Concerts of suppressed music, especially those featuring artists with little standing outside of this area of music making, arguably benefit organizers, offering a platform and visibility founded on the tragedy of others. Programs that openly integrate fundraising invite further skepticism along these lines. In addition to charges of opportunism or exploitation, hardly new, performances of music denigrated during the Nazi era navigate to varying degrees a precarious balance between music aesthetics and the related history. Privileging of the music, its worth above all, can invite charges founded in the ethics of Holocaust representation. The revivalist effort to repair a musical rupture and maintain historical continuity arguably conceals trauma, akin to what German studies scholar Erich Santner calls narrative fetishism. This charge similarly affects invocations of rebirth, which can hide victimization through emphasis on survival, as author of Traumatic Realism Michael Rothberg argues in his discussion of the movie Schindler's List. On the other hand, spotlighting the past in commemoration, the disproportionate reliance on the history of the Nazi era can lead to one-dimensional readings of the composers concerned, their individual biographies, musical styles, and repertoire subsumed by a larger association with the Holocaust. The terms Holocaust musician and Holocaust composer within concerts of suppressed music further work to conceal the distinctive features of the music and composers involved, as Loeffler has similarly argued. Here's example 6, and a poster. In rare direct response, Ernst Krenek underscored the complexities of his own output and biography as it opposes similar labeling, in this case the designation degenerate music, in the Los Angeles Philharmonic's titling of a 1991 event honoring his music. Quote, "I fail to see what my 90th birthday has to do with Entartete Kunst, degenerate art. If I should be associated therewith at all, it would seem to me more logical to select a work from the early 20s instead of the symphonic elegy, which I wrote in this country after that obnoxious concept had long become obsolete," unquote. Performances of music denigrated during the Nazi era are thus inherently a gray zone, one in which I myself entered, as Mike Beckerman reminded me, in the very writing of this paper. Am I complicit in the violence of the Holocaust when I write about it? I would like to add atop this unstable terrain consideration of what I read as a misleading correlation within some concertizing of suppressed music between the Holocaust and Jewish music. This final issue has to do with a confirmed, but also assumed Jewishness, so to speak, in concert-focused geography and venue. Here's example 1 again. First, concert focus. Though not all composers persecuted during the Third Reich were Jewish, by Hitler's estimation or their own, many programs in this realm of music making specifically highlight Jewish composers or music. To point out but a few examples, Judith Sheridan's Forbidden Voices features, quote, songs by Jewish composers which were banned by the Nazis in the 1930s, unquote. A concert on April 10th, 2010 in Santa Rosa, California was titled Music at the Edge of Life in remembrance of Jewish composers who perished in the Holocaust. Michael Christie's rediscovered Masters concerts of July 7th, 8th, and 27th, 2011 honored, quote, the music of Jewish composers who were silenced during World War II, unquote. Second, spatial spread and venue. To date, programs of music denigrated during the Nazi era have appeared in at least 22 different states, pointing to strong interest in the Holocaust throughout the United States. Such interest is bolstered by the celebratory role the Nazi era plays in the American self-image, as well as the power, to some extent, of dark tourism. But the popularity of these performances in New York, Arizona, and above all, California, especially Southern California, clearly reveals a Jewish connection. LA, of course, also the eventual home of so many emigre composers, now boasts a Jewish population second to New York City in size, and the 4th largest population in the world behind New York City, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. This, albeit brief explanation of concert geography, is confirmed by regular use of Jewish spaces as performance venues, synagogues, or in the case of the April 17, 2012 concert of Ullmann's music, centers for Jewish learning, such as Chicago's Spertus. Given these explicit Jewish connections, it may come as no surprise that there can be assumptions of Jewishness attached to programs that lack a singular focus on a supposed Jewish repertoire. An example, Recovered Voices, which actively avoids formal circumscription of its repertoire as Jewish, given what Christopher Kelsch, CEO of LA Opera, views as a potential danger in the re-ghettoization of the music and composers involved. The San Francisco Classical Voice nonetheless described Conlon's project under the heading Conlon to Direct Jewish Music Project. Similarly, Naomi Pfefferman in the Jewish Observer's article, The Best of Jewish Los Angeles 2008, included Recovered Voices under the category Best Places to See Jewish Opera, again labeling the project to some extent Jewish. Such association, confirmed or assumed, has a contextual foundation in part in a history of investment in the Holocaust within American Jewish communities. This investment has been and still is tied directly to self-identification as Jewish in the United States. In 1999, Peter Novick, in fact, recognized a potential fate in the Holocaust as the sole common link between American Jews. But this tie also relates to broader treatments of Jewish music today, channeling the ongoing problem of defining Jewish music. In What is Jewish Music, sponsored by the Jewish Virtual Library, excerpted from the Jewish Music Institute in London, Jewish music is today assigned several categories: Ashkenazi music, klezmer, Sephardi music, Israeli music, synagogue music, Western classical music, and suppressed music. Similarly, the ethnomusicologist Jeff UNESCO, based on his work on contemporary secular Jewish music in America, identifies, quote, unconscious assumptions about what could be admitted into a canon of authentically Jewish music: the pre-war, the Holocaust-related, or the Israeli. In scholarship as well, especially in Germany, we see this union between the Third Reich and Jewish music in the decades following the Holocaust. As musicologist Tina Fruhoff demonstrates, most studies in German musical scholarship post-World War II discuss Jewish music or musicians in the context of Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, or in relationship to anti-Semitism. At the National Meeting of the American Musicological Society in 2012, Florian Schading similarly commented on the close relationship between Jewish music and Exilforschung, exile studies in Germany. He argued that discussion of the music of composers displaced after Hitler's assumption of power has become proxy for investigation of Jewish music. Jewish music, for many, is synonymous with music of Nazi persecution. By bringing my discussion of the performances of music suppressed into this larger consideration of Jewish music, I hope to offer several final thoughts for your input and continued discussion. This concertizing arises from positive intentions related to rebirth, revival, and commemoration, pious perhaps. Still, like other efforts to effect constructive change through music, this area of performance is fraught with identity issues, perhaps the root of Zani's discomfort in Santa Monica, issues resulting from a complicated jumbling of history, music, and present self-identification through the past. With awareness of these competing layers, we in music can attend to the responsible handling of so-called suppressed music, and even work in scholarship as well as concert presentation to untangle, with an eye toward understanding, an increasingly confused popular merging of the Nazi-era Jewishness and music. By doing so, I wonder if we can avoid future support or confirmation of the notion that all music with any relationship to the Holocaust is Jewish, which shrouds distinction with this repertoire, similar to the havoc wreaked by the term Holocaust music, but also fuels misleading imaginings of Jewish music today. Though a sign of evolution, the idea that Jewish music is Holocaust-related, to me, harkens back to one-dimensional thinking that denies the complexities of the music involved. It also may support wider ossification of Jewish music as an entity of the past. In seeming contradiction, this dynamic music thereby lives and changes in the present as a music of memorial, trauma, and ultimately negation. Thank you. Not that I know of. I see the focus very much on Jewish music, as I'm saying.
Yes, Richard?
Well, thank you, Lily. You didn't disappoint me. I know you as somebody who's always looking for camps and works to open, and you did it. That was brave. And somebody who always cuts to the quick of things, but I think maybe you stopped a little short of the quick. At least as I see it. If you could put up, I know we only have a minute left, but could you put up James Leffler's quote, reported departure? Yeah. I know only too well what he's talking about. I don't know, a lot of us identify with Jewish music and with the Holocaust and so on. I don't know how many people here have been accused of being a censor, but I am one who has. So I have that also as one of the crosses that I bring to bear on all this, or that I'm bearing and bring to bear. I don't know what I mean. But all of the rubrics that you mentioned under which this music is performed have the additional effect of stigmatizing criticism, and therefore paralyzing the critical faculty. And that, of course, is something I think is very harmful to music, just as a practice, as a social practice, you know, especially classical music, which is in some trouble these days. So I object to this implied threat always at concerts like this that are given these pious commemorative names against anybody who might not happen to find the music particularly compelling. And that's the objection I would raise, rather than the way in which it limits the definition of a Jewish composer or something like that. It actually limits the resonance of the music. That the music must be interpreted only as a kind of commentary or ancillary commentary on a much bigger theme, which is the Holocaust. When I think also of other kinds of music that have been exempted or immunized from criticism, it would include the music of favorite composers of Nazis, of communist regimes, and so on. Krennikov's music could not be criticized, it would be reprisals if you did. That's also the case with Ullmann and Schulhoff. Even though a lot of the music is good, you'd better like it whether you think it's good or not. So I find this a big, big problem with music like this. And I wonder how we can evade that problem. When Mr. Conlon said in the opening remarks that we're waiting for the time when we're free to love or hate this music, I thought, yeah, we're waiting, but who elected you as he who gives permission, you know, to hate as well as love? It seems to me we have that right now, only we are discouraged from exercising. So, well, I guess that wasn't a question.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, I probably focused a bit on this problem of Jewish music as I saw these various assumptions, because that's been something that I've dealt with in the past, the problem of Jewish music, and I see this as a new issue in this ongoing problem. So I point to that, but there's a lot to discuss in this area. This is my first presentation in this area. So I'm really interested in people's feedback, and I really do want to promote a conversation where we can bring up some issues without it being seen as such a negative. Can't we discuss all of this without it being taken so personally or as such an insult? Because I certainly don't mean that today. I want to start a discussion. There's so many wonderful people involved in these projects, and a lot of noble intentions are always combined with some more negative ramifications. I actually don't know of any musical project that is just good, and that's just life. So I hope we can continue to discuss this, and I will certainly continue to write about other issues as I go forward.
I appreciate your hesitancy. You have to realize that you don't care who you and Godspeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that we're all ready to plan our next conference, re-criticizing Holocaust music. I feel I'm recovering because I get very uncomfortable when I see maps that don't have Long Island on them, because I was born there. Bob Elias, please. Thank you so much, Lily.
All right, moving right along, as we say. Now, we come to Maestro Conlon's talk this afternoon, and I assume everyone here knows who he is. I want to make only one one little comment in preparation for the very brief introduction, and that is that one of the things that I've noticed, and it comes to mind today, especially with Michael Haas's presence, the term entartete Musik as the sort of grouping of so many of these composers has been sort of a necessary evil, if I could use that word in connection with this, because it is actually the term of the Nazis. And when we use the English equivalency, very often I hear people talk about Hans Gall. Oh yeah, wasn't he a degenerate composer? Because the air quotations don't appear, and they're translating the word as they seem to understand it. And it occurs to me that in Los Angeles, and very much as a result of James Conlon's work and the LA Opera's project, Recovered Voices, which name we are borrowing from LA Opera with their gracious permission for our initiative here at the Colburn School, that in Los Angeles, I now much more hear about people talking about recovered voices composers. And I just make that note because that's an important shift in how these composers are viewed. And I've heard the term used other places as well. And we all know where it starts. So, the very briefest of introductions with the maestro's permission. James Conlon is the music director now for 35 years of Cincinnati's May Festival, the country's oldest choral festival. He is also currently the music director of the Ravinia Festival, the summer home of the Chicago Symphony, and when I say currently, I mean in another 6 hours he'll be back there. And he is, of course, music director of our Los Angeles Opera. He is also, of course, the Conlon in the Ziering-Conlon Initiative for Recovered Voices here at the Colburn School. Ladies and gentlemen, my great pleasure, James Conlon.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you for all of your interest in this big subject. Now I'm going to change the subject slightly, a little bit. You may not recognize it, that it belongs here until the end of the talk. It's called the Oblique Censor, and it is about, it is not specifically about the period that we are all engaged in, which is basically between 1933 and 1945, and all of the of course, damage that has done in history. The title, The Oblique Censor, you will recognize toward the end of this discussion. Censorship, the history of classical music has been interwoven with various forms of censorship, however benign some of them may have seemed or may have been meant to be. There is a continuum from complete freedom to write and present music to a public through a large gray area, all the way to a totalitarian force that literally dictates what may or may not be presented in public. This address will posit that although censorship in the strict sense of is virtually absent in our country, though perhaps not entirely, box office demands has replaced it as a potent force in selecting out what music will or will not be performed for a large segment of our concert-going public. As it is not adjudicated by any established ruling body, driven by any apparent political or religious viewpoint, nor presided over by any individual, its source is intangible and invisible. Its effect, nonetheless, is real. And however oblique its trajectory, its effect is widespread. And so therefore, I have called it the Oblique Censor. The long history of censorship implies a tacit recognition that music has the power to move us, our emotions, our hearts, affect our brains, alter our perceptions, influence our religious and political views. Or at least it appears capable of doing so, or is feared so by persons in authority who feel musical expression can upset the status quo. And that's not new. Plato thought so as well. Or, if you want to read about it in chapter 36 of the book of Jeremiah, he tells the story, or the story is told about how his works were burned because they were said to be too dark and pessimistic. Similarly, Confucius' works were destroyed about 250 years before the Christian era by an unsympathetic subsequent dynasty. Davide's arm, Michelangelo's Davide's arm, had been dropped off when some irate Florentines threw rocks at it because they were offended by the very statue. Venus de Milo was censored. The Bardler family gave rise to the eponymous practice of cleansing great but impure works and was responsible for things like the family Shakespeare and the family Gibbon. Now, I want to read just, because she was so kind and mentioned me so often, I'm going to read an excerpt from a wonderful book by Lily Hirsch called Music in America, Crime Prevention and Punishment. So Lily, with your permission, here it goes. I'm quoting you. One of the earliest philosophers of music, Plato recognized music's potential use toward good and bad. Music, the most celebrated of all forms of imitation, is the most dangerous as well. A mistake in handling it may cause untold harm, for one may become receptive to evil habits. To avoid music's potential danger to society, recognized in ancient Greece and thereafter, Plato thus had advocated the censorship of musical activity and the punishment for transgression by force if necessary. During the Roman Empire, this recommendation was implemented in the position of the censor, who, among other duties, monitored singing. If singing was found insulting or evil, the singer, according to a legal code of the 12 tables, 450 years before the Christian era, could be punished with death by clubbing. Thank God that doesn't happen to most of us who have to get up in public all the time. But Plato extolled music's ethical effects when handled correctly, for example, in his discussion of music education in the third book of the Republic, which maintains that music education helps man become, quote, noble and good, unquote. Then, going on, during the 19th century, within Romantic aesthetics as conceived by Hegel, I know you didn't want to mention it, but here it comes anyway, Lily, music was more consistently assigned an unrivaled, though vague, power over the soul. At this time, Plato's conception of music as moral and immoral was cut in half, and philosophers celebrated music's redemptive powers. The thinking was not lost on Romantic composers such as Felix Mendelssohn. He wanted more than success. He wanted to further humanity, communicating ethical meaning through music. This goal, a part of what music scholar and conductor Leon Botstein terms the Mendelssohnian project, resulted in several compositions, including the Lobgesang Symphony and the oratorios Paulus and Elijah. In these works, Mendelssohn sought to promote a sense of community, foster ethical sensibilities and faith in God, and educate society about tradition. In his use by his great-grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn, and his aesthetics and theology of Friedrich Schleiermacher, who believed music should heighten emotion in service of the religious faith. Before Mozart, and this is still all quoting from Lily Hirsch's book, before Mozart, Western art music had two fundamental purposes: to proclaim the glory of God in his churches and to provide musical decoration for the power in their courts and homes. In this way, before the Romantic era, music was valued based on use. Moreover, the value of music in use was generally not high. The arts associated with contemplation and theory were privileged above music making, which, connected to the use of the hands, was related to manual activity rather than mental pursuits. In the wake of the Romantic era, however, music was theorized as an ideal art. Part of man's changing valuation has to do with the sudden end of the patronage system toward the close of the classical era. For survival as an independent artist, composers had to justify and promote themselves and the worth of their art form. This promotion gave way to ideas that music both performs good and is good. With this change in stature, Romantic writers also established the concept of classical music, a term introduced in the 19th century to classify preceding works by Bach and Beethoven, among others, as great. The initial idea of classical music, therefore, corresponded to other attempts to valorize music in keeping with the general repositioning of music as high art. Now, all of that from Lily Hirsch's book. In America, we pride ourselves on an open-minded society. Whether or not we are is a much longer discussion and not intended to be entered into today. That at least our Constitution and laws largely upheld freedom of speech and expression. But our history provides many exceptions to that. Just a few examples. Anthony Comstock's 1868 raid on an offensive bookstore and the 1873 Anti-Obscenity Act, which he inspired, are 19th century examples. Later, with the support of police, Comstock swooped down on the Art Student League of 1906, objecting to nude models and, quote-unquote, obscene, lewd, and indecent photos that are, quote-unquote, commonly but mistakenly called art. A year earlier, he had condemned George Bernard Shaw as an Irish smut dealer. Shaw rewarded him by creating the term Comstockery, which he defined as, quote, the world's standing joke at the expense of the U.S. Europe likes to hear of such things. It confirms the deep-seated conviction of the old world that America is a provincial place, a second-rate country-town civilization after all, end quote. H.L. Mencken, who's even more succinct on the subject of Comstock, who, through his zealotry, quote, more than any other man, liberated American letters from the blight of Puritanism. Books are no longer banned, though sometimes they are burnt, and in post-war rural America, there's a type of vigilante substitute motivated by the same censorious impulse. Robert Atkins, in a 1994 essay, A Brief and Idiosyncratic History of Censorship, chronicles some of those book burnings in recent decades in rural America. A compilation of 6 surveys by librarians and libertarian organizations identified the 10 most attacked books in the U.S. between the years 1965 and 1994. They were The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank, Black Like Me, Brave New World, The Catcher in the Rye, The Good Earth, The Grapes of Wrath, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, Go Ask Alice, and A Farewell to Arms. The McCarthy era spared neither composers nor performers if they appeared on their zealous radar. Eisler, Copeland, Bernstein being just a few, and the list of Hollywood writers and actors exemplifies the use of blacklisting as an effective form of censorship. Despite these and many and other similar negative examples, American composers and performing arts institutions have never been subject to the powerful censorship historically exercised for instance, by the Roman Catholic Church, especially in Italy. As early as 1703, Pope Clement XI banned opera as immoral. The oratorio developed partially out of the prohibition against sending biblical and religious subjects in theaters. Nor have our composers been subject to the type or length of unrelenting interference that Giuseppe Verdi continually faced with the censors on the not yet unified Italian peninsula. None, no American that is, has faced the Stalinist regime as Shostakovich did, nor, as we are discussing at length this weekend, the cataclysmic suppression of the Nazi regime. So, is it justified to speak of censorship in our country? This country that was founded on the principle of freedom of speech and whose history, with occasional deviations, has upheld the values flowing from it? Strictly speaking, I guess the answer would be no. The subject of my inquiry is not any visible authorized body of censorship that affects what classical music is played or written, but a less visible factor that strongly influences performing arts institutions on their choices of what they produce. This less tangible factor is economic return, or popularity, generated by a particular composition or composer, better known in everyday parlance as box office appeal. Whereas overt official bodies of censorship have existed, whether governmental or religious, or offshoots of political opportunism or vigilantism, they have largely disappeared or have diminished function, only to be surreptitiously replaced by very practical economic factors. Most performing arts organizations are habitually faced with trying to calculate which works will do well at the box office and which will not. Gradually, those that do not sell adequately are performed less often. They become, so to speak, less popular. And then a vicious cycle comes into full play. The less well-known a work, the more likely it will not be performed. The more rarely it is performed, the less known it will become. For a piece of music to be played regularly today, it must be to some extent popular. That's a very tidy construction, fulfilling both the Founding Fathers' vision of democracy, the vote of the populace should rule, and our economic credo, the best product will sell the best. In other words, it's as American as apple pie. But viewed from the perspective of a performing artist or a serious lover of classical music, it is simply unacceptable to confuse a work's popularity with its inherent quality. Galileo's vision of the universe was a minority opinion, for which he was condemned, but he was right. I personally refuse to believe that the works of Alban Berg, Leos Janáček, and Benjamin Britten are intrinsically inferior to, let's say, Karl Orff. As an insider, I see how choices of repertory are made across the spectrum of performing arts organizations in our country. I'm on the other side of that question, clearly, because I see how planning is made and I see how planning is undone. Box office considerations have had and continue to have a profound effect on the dampening of our musical culture. There is no question that in time of economic difficulties, all institutions intensifying their risk-averse impulses will move toward tried and true, responding to their perception of what the public will buy. Experiments, unfamiliar works, world premieres, out-of-the-box projects, unknown composers are all put on hold, sometimes indefinitely. There is no malice, there is no authoritarian body judging the political, philosophic, or religious validity or danger of a given piece of music and its suitability for performance. Is adherence to box office values, I put that in quotes, literally censorship? Absolutely not. Does adherence have the same or similar results? In my opinion, absolutely yes. The problem, as I see it, is that the intrinsic value of pieces of music are now being judged by their commercial value or their commercial viability. The number of classic music lovers in the US is already a small fraction of the population, but even those with more than a passing interest are influenced by a given piece's popularity or saleability. Lack of familiarity, a cumbersome title, or even a piece's length becomes confused with quality. A somewhat amusing example, at least I found it amusing, 30 years later to tell this story, from my early experiences might serve as an illustration. More than 30 years ago, I was making a program with the artistic administrator of one of America's leading orchestras for a program that would also feature its very fine chorus. I proposed Benjamin Britten's Cantata Misericordiam, a work I love. After several days of reflection, the administrator contacted me and said, it would be best if we did not include it on the program. Any work with the word misery in it would be a, quote, downer, unquote, at the box office. I tried in vain to explain that misericordium comes from a Latin root meaning mercy, that the cantata was a retelling of the parable of the Good Samaritan, and that there was absolutely nothing miserable about it. The cantata went unplayed, at least on that occasion. The word long has become synonymous with boredom in many minds. One hears often, I don't like Wagner, it's too long. Or, I wouldn't go to a performance of the Matthew Passion, it's too long. Now, cultural differences play a role in these perceptions. German audiences are generally more capable of sitting and concentrating at a concert or an opera than we are. Their word, Sitzfleisch, is testimony to this. In my early years as music director of the Rotterdam Philharmonic in Holland, that's Rotterdam, Holland, by the way, not Rotterdam, New York, we presented the Matthew Passion every year on Thursday and Friday preceding Easter to sold-out houses, audiences filled by people, many of whom only went to a concert once a year. Long is not a value judgment in these cases. But unfamiliarity, either with a composer's name or with a particular less-known work by a famous composer, is perhaps the leading culprit at the box office. The very presence of such a name on a program is deemed capable of emptying the house, even when it shares the program with big sellers like Tchaikovsky or Beethoven. It takes no leap of imagination to understand why this is a major stumbling block in attempting to introduce the music of composers suppressed in Nazi Germany. More as collateral damage than by design, the voice of many compositions is stifled by these phenomena. Although not censorship in any literal meaning of the word, the results are the same. This problem will intensify in the future. If this trend continues, because less familiar will become unfamiliar, and unfamiliar will become unknown. A public cannot clamor for what it doesn't know. It can only be hoped that a public can be motivated by curiosity and made to be open to what it doesn't yet know. And so, oblique as it may be, there's a powerful invisible force that is actually functioning to separate out works based on their monetary worth. Classical music from the time of the Medicis has always depended on patronage. It has never, and I believe cannot, stand the test of a for-profit business venture. It loses, not makes money. The decisions made in performing arts administrations is rarely about what will make money, but rather what will lose less money. And this also is a very important factor now because, and I go off my script for a moment, it is demonstrable that power has been associated with censorship, political power, totalitarian regimes, the very, very powerful Roman Catholic Church. There is a power in money. Monetary power is real, and it exists, and it is fundamental in our society. So consequently, it is the major factor in dividing out what is being performed and not being performed in classical music today. Yes, to some degree, there of course are exceptions. There are performances and performers who will go out there knowingly to a sparsely attended hall, but because their conviction about certain music or certain pieces is so strong that some will go along with it. But no performing artist, and I'm basically a performing artist, we are constantly confronted with suggesting, brainstorming, imaginative ideas. We say, let's do this, let's do that. Nobody's heard this, nobody's heard that. Let's do it, let's bring it to the public. And the answer is, in the words of one of my favorite deceased colleagues who was a great manager of orchestras and concert houses, I'm sure it's a great idea. All 15 people in the audience will love it. A facetious answer, but one that's usually the end of the conversations. Now, which brings me to the point of some of the challenges of bringing recovered voices composers into the contemporary environment. The problems encountered are not unique to the lesser-known composers who were suppressed during the Nazi regime. They are extensions of the phenomena already described. The eventual goal of recovered voices, as I see it, is to integrate this music into concert programming so that it need not fall under any category related to the life experiences and the composer's experiences, nor the historical conditions under which they were wrote. In this, I thoroughly second what I understand Lily to be addressing in her work to James's concerns, and which is why, as I have defined my mission, my vision of recovered voices, which is essentially, though it has a strong moral aspect, which I have outlined, it has a strong historical aspect, which I have outlined. It is ultimately an artistic question. It is about music that should, in my opinion, and that opinion can be and should be contradicted by people who don't agree with me about any particular piece of music or composer, but it is music that should be played, must be played, can be loved, can be admired, or can be disliked and hated. Mr. Taruskin is right. We do have that right at this moment, but I would like to see, along with that right being practiced, I would like to see the amount of information commensurate to the amount of music that is still as yet unplayed. The most common obstacles, I'm going back to my script now, the most common obstacles I have encountered in trying to interest people in recovered voices are attitudinal. Their refrains are familiar. Quote, there are no lost masterpieces, unquote. Quote. What would they have said to Felix Mendelssohn in 1829 when he first presented the Matthew Passion in Leipzig? Or do these same people think that only masterpieces happen to survive the destruction of pre-Columbian art by the conquistadores? As if some very intelligent conquistador was able to differentiate between a masterwork or not. And then there's a corollary. Quote, how good can it be if I have never heard of it? Unquote. Implying to me that one's own acquaintance with a piece of music is a prerequisite for any possible worth that piece of music might possess. The fact is that many so-called music lovers ignore certain works is due to, yes, their ignorance of the works. Now, I'm not here to criticize that ignorance, but I am here to say that the data, the information, the music itself has not been sufficiently played for persons, many people, to not be ignorant of its existence. The oblique censorship of those attitudes aggravates the difficulties in interesting the public in lesser known works. So we have to begin with the censorship, the oblique censorship of financial issues, combined with an attitudinal thing as, well, I don't know it, why should I hear it? I don't know that composer's name, I'm going to stay home. I don't know, I've never heard pieces, you know, I like to go, if I'm going to go out and enjoy myself, entertain myself at a concert, I'd rather go to hear something that I know I'm going to like, and of course, Tchaikovsky and Beethoven, who are both great composers and should not be blamed for this phenomenon, I'd rather hear something that I know. If I see SKI at the end of a concert, I start to get scared and I don't want to buy a ticket. Well, these problems are not limited to the public. Many musicians themselves are very conservative in their tastes and also resistant to new music. New music, whether it be contemporary music or whether it be something from the past, that is new to them. Sometimes the press is very well informed and objective and constructive, and sometimes the press is not. Some are content with facile and flippant reactions, passing judgments on the basis of limited knowledge of the terrain. Now, I myself have been attacked. I've been attacked by neo-Nazi bloggers. I've been criticized periodically in the press for presenting music that isn't very, very good, but that it has an interesting background. Lily and James have discussed this phenomenon, and if I'm on the stage, it is to say that at least I believe that that piece of music is good enough to be heard and should be heard, and that it is, and that is exactly what it is. It's about the music. It is always about the music. And I recall, and I can dig it up because I've went on the internet to find it. One of the first concerts that I gave when I came back to the States and when I started performing any of this music was in Carnegie Hall in April of 2003. A long review by Bernard Holland of the New York Times asked some of the same questions that are being asked today. I quote, "What are we to do when the story attached to a piece of music threatens to overwhelm the music itself? Be wary. Music sends its wordless messages by way of tones moving through time. Outside interference dilutes music's powers of expression. Or else be satisfied. Music is a part of life and all of its stories." So those are the two views. Is it the piece or is it the piece and its stories? And the answer is there's no answer to that, because whereas art and music is a product of its time and the circumstances in which a painting was painted or a piece of music was written, still music and all the arts exist outside of time. So the value to us is not the story. The value is the piece of music. Now, Mr. Holland was, and he goes on to, I think, at least as I read it as a sensitive artist, you know, we're all very sensitive the night after, as criticizing the effort to put on this music. He used a few examples which I found unfortunate because I think that they unfairly took the attention from the piece of music. If Ullmann, and it was a concert that included some of Victor Ullmann's music, were advertised to the world as the work of an American Midwesterner who had died of old age in his sleep, would it, on musical merit alone, receive the notice it now does, or indeed any notice at all? And if not, do we serve music as a whole by giving attention to pieces whose qualities, taken by themselves, rarely rise above the competent and the agreeable? Well, excuse me, but who is he to say rarely rise above the competent and agreeable? Rarely. How much music, I asked myself, does Bernard Holland actually know? I, as a practicing musician who has deeply interested my music, and at that time, for more than a decade, I barely know a lot of it. There is so much of it to know. I don't know even a fraction of that. Now, I may be underestimating Mr. Holland. He may have known a great deal about that and much more than I did. But I found that to be an unfortunate criticism at a time when this important subject was being exhibited or put on display for the first time. And then the final blow came toward the end of the review. Unimaginative minds, hungry for a second-hand idea that might attract grant money, a few lines in the newspapers, and a respectable sale of tickets, by the way, he's wrong about that, knew that here was an idea with instant recognition and an unassailable sentiment in its favor. Now, correctly, both again, James and Lily have brought our attention to the dangers of confusing issues. But I think in those cases, that is the type of criticism that we get from the other side. We do get a certain amount of praise for the effort and for bringing the music to the public, but you also get some of the reaction to that, and so be it. That is what living with recovered voices and the mission means, and I've taken that upon my shoulders, and it will remain there. So I'm often asked how the music is received. How do people like this music? And my answer is generally quite well. That's not always, that's not every piece, but in general, quite well. The problem is not so much getting people to like it, but getting them to come to the performances, to getting them to listen in the first place. At LA Opera, we generally gave a maximum of 4 performances of each of the Recovered Voices opera, but the audience that was there was vociferous in its appreciation. There were some who returned more than once to the same production to see the opera again. Many people still will not buy a ticket, but those who have bought tickets have tended to return for more. I am not now, nor have I ever suggested that under the very broad umbrella term of Recovered Voices, and that's important, it is an umbrella term. There is the only unifying concept of this term is that it is an attempt. They are not the voices. It is our attempt to bring to the public's attention the existence of a large body of music which was suppressed in one way or the other in the Nazi regime. And why do I concentrate on the Nazi regime? Because it is German classical music, and that is my discipline. I don't have, for instance, probably what is lost in Stalinist Soviet Union is enormous. But we have no idea. At least I don't have it. It's not my subject. My subject is classical music as we learned it in conservatory, which means the Germanic tradition, Italian, Russian, French, English, Czech. That was the most damaged by the Nazi regime. There are, in my opinion, hundreds, if not thousands of pieces. I've never suggested that every one of them is a masterpiece. First of all, I'm not inclined to throw around the term promiscuously. Every piece cannot, by definition, be a masterpiece. It's a contradiction in terms, and nor need it be. We do not live by masterworks alone. A Rembrandt pencil sketch is not the Night Watch, but it's still Rembrandt. A Bastien or Mitridate Re di Ponto is not Don Giovanni, but it's still Mozart. My mission is to play many of the compositions that were weeded out, not by objective musical judgment, but by the Nazi regime for self-serving political and racist motives. When they are played and listened to by a large segment of our concert-going public and played repeatedly by fine, committed performances, that is to say, no tokenism, this is about performers who are committed to the works that they are performing, it will be a more appropriate time to make judgments about their ultimate worth and where and whether they fit into the ever-evolving canon of works which we refer to as classical. Those judgments are now often made on the basis of fleeting acquaintance, if not downright ignorance. I am advocating that we make more of an effort to play a sizable amount of very good music that has been arbitrarily removed from our cultural patrimony by unqualified individuals, that is to say, the Nazi regime. The Oblique Censor militates against this. I am also not insisting that everyone like every piece of this period. De gustibus non disputandum est. I just want everybody to everyone to have a chance to taste this music before they decide whether or not they want it as nourishment on a more regular basis. And that's my speech for today. Okay. I'm getting the signal. I can take a few questions. You know, I know everybody's hungry, so Bob, just stop me when everybody's stomachs are growling. Okay. Questions? Mr. Teruskin, I'm waiting for you.
I thought you listened. You know, I have to say, I don't think I disagreed with any particular thing you said for the past hour. Just wanted to get that straight, including your implied very negative judgment of Bernard Holland's piece, and I guess all of his writing. But I do think what you said requires a sort of conceptual challenge. You rightly decry censorship. I'm sure everybody rightly decries censorship. And when I said before that I didn't accuse of being a censor, I meant it, of course, quite ironically, because so many things get called censorship which really ought not to be called censorship. And I would say that you have indulged in that practice a bit by calling economic considerations an oblique form of censorship, and you have, by quoting Bernard Holland in a very invidious context, implicated criticism in the practice of censorship. They do have something in common, all of these things. Censorship and economics, or the financial influence on music programming and criticism, these are all aspects of mediation. But to lump all aspects of mediation into one category, especially a category which is tainted by the fact that one of the members of the set is censorship, I think, again, kind of paralyzes a constructive critique of the situation. If censors, critics, concert management, these are all gatekeepers, right? Can you imagine, and so were the Medici, right? The patrons whose practices you were holding up as an implicit, or something that our present day concert situation cannot live up to because now we're prey to the vagaries of the marketplace. Can you imagine a situation where there are no gatekeepers? Or are you, as I would say, not meaning now to issue any kind of a moral challenge, but I think that this is necessarily the case when we decry the aspects of gatekeeping or mediation that we deplore, are we asking instead that we be appointed gatekeeper? Because it seems to me that there is no such thing as a musical practice devoid of gatekeeping. And obviously there is have anything else in mind that the artists themselves, performing artists themselves, can also function as gatekeepers? How would that work practically? And would that be any less unjust than the existence of other gatekeepers? So I guess I could put it in the form of a question.
First of all, actually, I basically agree with you. I think we're just as bad as everybody else, by the way, as performers. Well, as performers and artists, we're not no better than anybody else in making final judgments. I don't even take my own judgment seriously. If I like a piece of music,
Somebody has to exercise that function.
yes, absolutely. And just for the record, my use of remembering that review, it's a very specific review. I'm not talking about all criticism. I'm not talking. Absolutely, I agree with you. There must be gatekeepers. There are no that's only an anarchist could say we don't need any gatekeepers. And there.
As there are gates, there have to be gatekeepers.
Absolutely. And Mr. Trescott, you're one of the best, if not the best. So, my respect for that, the necessity for that is absolute. That was a very specific quote. It was not meant to be a generic refusal either of criticism or of gatekeeping, as you refer to it, which is a very good one. And by the way, the Medici, you bring up a very good point there. The patrons, the Medici, or any of the other powerful families of Florence, were responsible for our even having that art in the first place, and so we're thankful to them. So that's a form of gatekeeping. And the fact is that there was a carrot and a stick for every artist. And the carrot and the stick was very simple: employment. If you could get a commission from the Medicis, if you could get a commission from the church, you had employment. You could eat for 2 years. And in fact, it was in your interest to take longer to make that fresco, because if you really took good care with it, you would eat for 2 years. As soon as the fresco was finished, you didn't know if you were going to have another job. That is a form, yes, is that a form of weeding out, gatekeeping? Yes, absolutely. I'm lucky to have a job. So, of course, I have to please my patron. Those artists had to please the patron. For instance, how many Renaissance paintings do you see with a nice couple down on their knees praying in the corner? They're the patrons. That's the family who paid for the painting. So there's been a give and take, and I may be a little bit naive, but I'm not. I have no imagination that art can just exist by itself without reality. We all live in a world. We live in a world that includes political systems, governments, churches. Some of those governments are totalitarian. Some of them, there are very few societies that are freer than us. But yet there are other things that come into it. The marketplace, the freedom of the marketplace, is almost a law, and we live with it. Perhaps it's poetic license to even use the term oblique censorship. Maybe it's a misuse of the term. I have to think about that. You've rattled me now. I have to think about that. But the point is that the same effect, in the end, is whether it is an arbitrary, unjust censorship, as history has shown, or whether it's a benign one, or one that is unavoidable. It's still we have to deal with it, and so we are. But thank you very much. By the way, I love your books, and especially the one about Mussorgsky, which is one thing that I absolutely love, and I'm very honored that you're here. Even it shook me up when I knew that you were here, but I'm very happy that you are. Yes, sir. Ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So but briefly, the question is, or the question, since visual values are increasingly being considered more important, or at least as important in opera, what do people look like, as opposed, how do they go on the screen has become a big issue. Sometimes better voices are best apart. Yes, I decry this, because yes, everybody would like to imagine Isolde looking like Marilyn Monroe, but it rarely happens. And for instance, I mean, I'm old enough to have grown up in a really golden era in New York at the Met, and heard many singers who today might have trouble getting engagements because they don't look like movie stars. It is a similar phenomenon. But censorship, I'm a little bit admonished now. Perhaps this is the wrong word to be using for it. Is it censorship because there's a gatekeeper? The gatekeeper is, I guess, in that sense, are the producers of the opera, the heads of opera companies. No, we want this one. She looks that way. This one doesn't. This one's good on camera. That one's not. For me, coming from the conviction that although opera is theater too, and I am not a conservative, and I do not believe that everything has to look like the original production from 200 years ago or 150 years ago, I am, however, a believer that the primary dramatist is the composer. The primary conduit of drama is also the composer, and that the reason these works have survived 100, 150, 200, 250 years is essentially because of their musical value, not their necessarily the theatrical trappings in which everybody can make fun of Il Trovatore, because everybody knows since the Marx Brothers that Il Trovatore is a funny story. But Il Trovatore still holds fascination because it is such great music. There are very few operatic librettos that would survive, or can survive, or do survive, taken away from that music. And please don't mention von Hofmannsthal or any of the best of them, Boito's, Falstaff and Otello, or Pelléas and Mélisande, these, which are, or the Oscar Wilde works, like Salome, like A Florentine Tragedy. Very few of them have managed to survive because of the essence, the dramatic essence, if it weren't for the music. That's a musician's point of view, yes. I guess I have that prejudice, and this is not coming from a person who disdains theater. It comes from a person who loves theater and is devoted to it, and I frankly don't think you should conduct opera unless you do love theater. But I regret the tendencies to which you are referring, and yes, indeed. I see that it's dinner time, Speaking of Salome, yeah. Okay, sir. Sir? I hear the dinner bell ringing. TBD, to be discussed. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I really love your assessment of this type of censorship that we have here in America. I do take it as a cultural, contextual, national sort of observation on your part, because you did compare us to Europe and other countries that relax six flights. That's a cultural thing. But there was one term that I didn't hear you mention in your talk. It seems to belie the whole thing, and it seems to me not
Well, it's absolutely true. I did not mention the word capitalism. However, I did refer to market values, and I did refer to democracy. In other words, I said this is a democratic idea. A popularity should win the day. It's okay, we're going to see this opera, or we're going to listen to this concert. Well, it's very popular. Eventually popularity will play a role, just as it does in democracy. In other words, a majority of people are interested, or more people are interested in X or Y. Same thing for the market values. And frankly, I think I did make a, perhaps oblique, if I can use that word, reference to capitalism in saying that the power of the saleability of classical music is a determinant. And of course, that's, I think, I'm not an economist, but I think that's capitalism and market 101. I mean, the market is going to rule. The market rules in America. The market rules. We are a tiny fraction. The classical music world is a tiny fraction of the populace, but I still think it's important, and I think that it is important that it be preserved. But we are dealing, sometimes we are overwhelmed. Look at all the problems that all the institutions are having. We are overwhelmed. We are a tiny part of this, of our society. We're a tiny part of the economic pie. And how do I take that? It's a fact of life, A, and B, makes me more determined than ever to do everything, that nothing happens to classical music and that we keep going so that we do not disappear, and it does not disappear for subsequent generations. That's it. That's the dinner bell. It's official. Thank you so much, all of you.